Good afternoon. It is Sunday, February the 7th, and we are ready to continue our series in the Gospel account of Mark. Thanks for taking the time to view this video. We didn't have one last week. I was out of pocket, but glad to be back with you this time, and we're going to be picking up where we left off before in Mark chapter 14. So I would encourage you to have your Bibles open there if you'd like. We'll have the passages on the screen, most of them from Mark, and so you can read them there if you like. If you'd like to look in your copy of the Bible, that's fine too. Now, as we get into, we're down to verse 43 is where we're picking up today with the betrayal and arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And remember, perhaps you remember, if you watched the last installment, that at the end of it, we had made the point that Jesus received his answer from his Father regarding his prayer in verses 36 and 39. Where Jesus said, if it's possible, let this cup pass. He said, I know all things are possible with you. And so he wanted to be able to fulfill his Father's will without suffering, if it were possible. But the overarching desire of Jesus was for his Father's will to be done. And so that's how he ended that prayer, was that's what I will, but more importantly, Father, do what you will. And Jesus received his answer. He was going to have to suffer, and he did so willingly. He could have stopped it at any point, but he didn't. And so he set aside his own desire for comfort and for freedom from pain and suffering. He set aside those desires to do his Father's will, and so he had told his disciples in verse 42, let's go. The one who betrays me is at hand. And so we pick it up in verse 43 with Mark saying, immediately while he was still speaking. So while he was still wording what we know as verse 42, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. So Judas, one of the 12, and Jesus had previously said, way back in verse 18 of this chapter, to the 12, he said, one of you will betray me. And Mark identifies Judas as one of the 12, as the one who came accompanied by the soldiers who are armed. But they came with the authority of the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now, going all the way back to chapter 8, verse 31, is where Jesus identified that group of people, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, as being the ones who will be responsible for his being arrested and killed. And here they are, representatives from that group. And the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders basically were the Sanhedrin council. The Sanhedrin was this council of judges, if you will, some 70 to 72 of them, who dealt with legal and religious cases, court cases for the Jewish people. And Jesus is going to appear before them just in a few verses. And so we'll say more about them when we get there. All right, verse 44, now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard. After coming, Judas immediately went to him, saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. They laid hands on him and seized him. So Judas had told them, when we get there, I'll identify the one that you're to take by walking up to him and giving him a kiss. Now, some might ask, well, why was that necessary? Why did Judas have to give them any kind of signal? Well, if you think about it, the soldiers who were going there to apprehend him, probably a lot of them may not have known who he was. They didn't have wanted posters with photographs to identify people, and so there had to be some way for Judas to identify the one that they were to take, and that's how he decided to do it. Now, the word kiss, whomever I kiss, is it's the Greek word phileo that can be translated, and most often is translated, love, but specifically brotherly love. Phileo, it sounds like Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia is a combination of two Greek words, love and brother, adelphos. So the love of a brother. Well, that's phileo. That's from this word. And so it's ironic that Judas would say, I'm going to give the kiss of a brother to identify the one that I'm betraying, the one that you're going to arrest. It's just an ironic thing that he would use that means and use that term to describe what he was doing to Jesus. And so he does that. Verse 45, Judas walked up to him, called him Rabbi, teacher, and kissed him. And now, interestingly, this is the last thing that Mark will say about Judas. The other writers, the other gospel writers, will say more about Judas. Matthew will go into a lot of detail about Judas taking the 30 pieces of silver and then taking them back and throwing them on the floor and going out and hanging himself and all of that. Mark doesn't do that. This is the last you know anything about Judas as far as Mark's account is concerned. And it didn't fit Mark's purpose to go into all of that detail. Mark is going to focus primarily through the rest of this chapter on the difference between, the contrast between Jesus and Peter. And we called attention to that in our last lesson, as we noted that Peter was one who expressed his desire to do what was right, going so far as to say, I will never deny you, and even if I have to die for you, I will. And Jesus told him, the spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. Peter wanted to do what was right, but in the end, he didn't. Jesus, on the other hand, wanted to avoid suffering. That was his prayer. Let this cup pass. But he put the Father's will first and was willing to deny himself to do the will of his Father. Peter was not willing to do that. So we talked about that contrast. And Mark's going to focus on that contrast between Jesus and Peter in this chapter. And in a moment, you're going to see Mark going back and forth. Here's what's happening with Jesus. Here's what's happening with Peter. Here's what's happening with Jesus. Here's what's happening with Peter. And so that is more Mark's emphasis. And that's why he doesn't tell us anything more about Judas in his gospel account. All right, so we continue, verse 47. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. So again, back to pulling us back into the context or into the event. Judas has walked up. He's identified Jesus with the kiss. And when he does that, these armed soldiers rush over to Jesus and apprehend him. Well, this causes one of the 12 that Mark doesn't name, but John does, to draw a sword and start swinging it. And there was a servant of the high priest who was there, and Peter, who is the one wielding the sword, John tells us that, John 18, verses 10 and 11, he cuts off the ear, as he's swinging the sword, he cuts off the ear of this servant of the high priest. Jesus heals the man. Mark doesn't mention that, but the others do. But so Peter draws his sword and starts swinging it. Again, an indication of Peter's desire to defend Jesus, Peter's desire to follow Jesus in the establishing of his kingdom. But remember that the disciples, the 12, had a misunderstanding about the nature of that kingdom. We've talked about it throughout our study of Mark, that there are these times when they give indication that they don't understand the spiritual nature of the kingdom that Jesus had come to establish. They think of it in terms of a political thing, and they've always thought of the Messiah as being the one who is going to come and release them from the power of any oppressors. And of course, in the first century, that was Rome. The Jewish people were under Roman rule, and they had to answer to the Romans. And so the disciples believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Peter confessed that, chapter 8. But they had a hard time grasping this concept of a suffering Messiah, a dying Messiah. They expected him to rise up in military fashion and deliver them from Rome. And Peter gives an indication right here that he is ready for revolt. He is ready to make it happen. And no doubt they thought this was it. Jesus had done nothing thus far to usher in this revolution against the Romans, but what better time to do that than when they come to finally arrest him. And so now that he's coming to be arrested, surely this is the time. And one of the other gospel accounts records Peter as he's drawing his sword saying, "Shall we smite with the sword?" Right? So is it time? And as he's asking the question, he's swinging it. So he was ready. But Jesus puts a stop to it. And he said to them, let's look at verse 48. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures." And they all left him and fled. So Peter tries to fight, and he swings his sword. Now again, Mark doesn't record what Jesus said specifically to Peter, which was, "Peter, put your sword up. He that lives by the sword will die by the sword," that statement. But Jesus stops Peter from doing what he's trying to do in starting this physical confrontation. And Jesus, then in verse 48, Jesus turns to the soldiers and those that had apprehended him, and he basically asked them, why'd you expect a fight out of me? Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me like you would some common thief? I was with you every day in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. You had plenty of opportunities to seize me in the past if you wanted to. But now you come at me like I'm some kind of common thief? Why did you expect that you would need swords? Why did you expect that you would need clubs, weapons, to apprehend me when you've seen me day after day and you see how I conduct myself? Why did you think you would need a fight? Well, the answer may be in what we just talked about: misunderstandings about the kingdom. The people, remember, we're still within just a few days of the triumphal entry. Now, that's been a while back in our study, but it hasn't been a long time since it happened historically. We're just within a few days of that having happened. And remember what the people were crying out to Jesus as he came into Jerusalem? "Son of David, What's that? That's messianic language. So the people were ready. The people were willing to accept him as their Messiah and their king. And so this was no doubt on the minds of the chief priests and the scribes who sent these soldiers, that, if the people think he's the Messiah, and if he thinks he's the Messiah, then he may try something. He may try an armed revolt, because they all had this military concept of the Messiah and the kingdom and all that. So they come at him with swords and clubs to squash any kind of violent revolt that Jesus might call upon his disciples to engage in. Peter tries to, but Jesus stops him. And so Jesus calls attention to the fact that, you could have taken me at other times, but you didn't. You come at me at night, and you come at me like I'm some common thief. Jesus was pointing out the fact that they were cowards. They weren't going to take him in the daytime. They weren't going to take him in the presence of the people. Because remember, the religious leaders feared the people. And so they were cowards, and Jesus is pointing that out. And the things that Jesus had done, he had done openly. Look, I've been in the temple. You've known where I've been. The Apostle Paul will later say, when he's on trial before, I can't remember at this point if it was Felix or Festus. Felix, I think, Acts 26, verse 26, when he said, regarding Jesus and the miracles and everything that Jesus did, he said, these things were not done in a court. No, I think it was Agrippa. It wasn't Felix or Festus, it was Agrippa. Because he was a Herod and lived in that area. And so Paul says to Agrippa, Acts 26, these things were not done in a corner, when he's talking about the things Jesus did, the miracles and all of that. In other words, Paul is saying to Agrippa, you know good and well that what I'm telling you is the truth. That Jesus did these things. He didn't do them in a corner somewhere. He did them out in the open. And that's what Jesus is saying to these soldiers here. Look, I've been here. Why do you think that you need to come at me armed when you know how I've conducted myself and that I've been no threat in any kind of a violent way? But he said all of these things have taken place to fulfill the scriptures. Now, he doesn't mention a specific scripture. I think he could be referencing, probably is referencing, just the general references to the suffering of the Messiah. Them coming out to him, arresting him, the treatment that they're going to give him, the abuse that they're going to give him, is all to fulfill the scriptures that predicted the suffering of the Messiah. And then verse 50 says they all left him and fled. Well, Jesus had told them that they would, back in verse 27 of this chapter. He said, the shepherd's going to be struck and the sheep are going to scatter. And he was talking to his disciples. Well, here they do it. They forsake him and flee. Well, why did they do that? Why did now all of a sudden they run off when just a few moments before Peter is swinging a sword? Well, I think when you think about it, it'll come to you, because Jesus just rejected Peter's offer to fight. Jesus rejected what Peter did. He rejected Peter's action. There was not going to be a revolt. Jesus was not going to lead them in revolution against the Romans. And so their worlds are coming apart. Now confusion sets in. With their misconception of the nature of the kingdom and the nature of the Messiah, they were still expecting some kind of revolution. And here was the opportunity for Jesus to do it. And he doesn't. And he tells Peter, put your sword up. That's not what this is about. And he's allowing himself to be taken. So confusion then leads to self-preservation. They take off. Jesus is not going to I mean, our leader is giving up. He's giving in. I'm getting out of here. And so they all run off. So think about this, instead of denying self, they're trying to preserve self. Instead of denying self and staying there with Jesus and following him wherever he goes, now they're giving up because he hasn't met their expectations. And so they flee. And then comes a strange couple of verses. A young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him. But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. Alrighty. Mark is the only one of the gospel writers that records this. And nothing else is said about it. The young man is not identified. And that's it. We're just told that. Now, some people have offered the possibility that this is a reference to Mark himself, that this young man was Mark. And there are commentaries that go into giving all these reasons why that could be the case and all that, but ultimately it's speculation. Is it possible that it could be Mark? Yeah, sure. But it's possible it could have been, a couple of dozen other people too. But that's it. Nothing more is said about it. Now, one thing that it does tell us is that had the apostles not run off, then they likely would have been captured too, because that seems to be what these soldiers are doing. Okay, they've apprehended Jesus, and as soon as that, when Jesus tells Peter, "Put your sword up," and he's not going to fight, then they take off. But these soldiers are evidently trying to grab people that are associated with Jesus, because they grabbed this young man who was following Jesus. He was there as a part of having followed the group evidently to the garden, and so he had some association with Jesus that the soldiers knew about, and so they tried to grab him, but he is able to escape. We don't know anything more about who that is or why it's recorded there. It's just kind of a strange thing, and that's part of why some people might think, well, maybe that was Mark, and he's just kind of throwing that in there because he knew it happened because it was him. It's possible, but there's no way to ever prove it. All right. Well, now in 53, we're going to have Jesus in his trial before the Sanhedrin, before this Jewish council. All right. So 53, they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. All right, so really at this point is where Mark is going to go through the end of this chapter back and forth. Here's what's happening with Jesus. Here's what's happening with Peter. And so Jesus is led away to the high priest, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. That's the Sanhedrin council. That's where he is and who he is appearing before. Mark tells us that Peter had followed at a distance. Peter still wants to follow Jesus on some level. Yes, he just ran off in the garden, I think, again, because of confusion that set in, because this was not turning out the way he was expecting it to, and so he runs off. But he's still concerned about Jesus, and he still wants to know what's going to happen, and so he hasn't completely turned his back on the Lord. He still wants to be associated in some way, so he's following at a distance, but he's keeping his distance. There's some risk of him coming back and being in the company of those who had just tried to apprehend them. And so he's warming himself there by the fire with the officers. Evidently, perhaps some of those that had been there in the garden at the time of the arrest. Now, the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. Well, there hasn't been a trial yet, and yet the verdict was already in place. They had already decided Jesus was going to die. Now, so the verdict is in. We hadn't even had a trial, but the verdict is determined. Now we've just got to, put the pieces together so that we can at least have some kind of justification for what we're about to do. That's kind of how they're approaching this. So they weren't. So they're trying to get evidence, but they're not getting any. They're not finding any. And the reason is Jesus had done nothing that was deserving of capital punishment. But they're going to try. And interestingly, they had falsely accused Jesus of breaking the law in the past. They had labeled him as a lawbreaker when he had broken none. But they, the leaders, are going to shred their own law to convict Jesus. And I'm going to list a few things for you that I've come across in some of the things that I've read. And this is not an exhaustive list. And depending on how people interpret certain things in the Jewish civil law from the Mishnah, the writings of the rabbis and their commentary on the law and things like that, people divide this up different ways, and I've seen as many as 18 to 20-something specific laws that were violated in the trial of Jesus. I'm just going to mention a handful of those since we're here at the beginning of the trial. And these, incidentally, come from the Mishnah Sanhedrin section, chapters 1 through 7-ish. So if you want to go back to the original sources and read in the Mishnah, you can come across these. But here's one. Capital crimes could not be tried at night. That was a part of their law, their civil statutes that had developed over time. Well, when is all of this happening with Jesus? At night. So there's a violation. Defendants were not to be questioned by a single judge. Well, Jesus goes first to the high priest, who questions him. He's going to be, yes, he's going to appear before the whole group, but he's also going to have some private consultation. That wasn't supposed to happen. Sanhedrin could not originate charges. It could only investigate charges brought before it. Talking about the council. Well, throughout this whole thing, they're going to be the ones that are bringing charges against Jesus. They weren't supposed to be doing that. There were a lot of laws in place among the Jewish court system that were designed to try every way in the world that they could to not put someone to death. In order for a person to be sentenced to death, there had to be there were so many hurdles that had to be overcome, and it was that way on purpose, because they didn't want to execute somebody that they weren't dead level sure that they deserved it. And so you had all kinds of things that they had in place. And they keep violating them. Trials were not to be held on the eve of a holy day or festival. Well, these things are happening early on a Friday morning. What's the next day? The Sabbath. And they're also at the time at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So they were not supposed to have these kinds of trials at this time of the year. A capital trial could not begin and end on the same day. This was another part to try to help the accused. They wanted for the council to have time to thoughtfully deliberate on whether or not a person deserves to die. And so they were not supposed to begin and end a capital trial on the same day. They needed to go home and sleep on it and come back at it with a fresh mind on the second day before they gave their final verdict. Well, this is all going to happen on the same day with Jesus. A defendant could not be asked to incriminate himself, but they're going to do that with Jesus. They're going to ask him, hey, are you the Christ or not? They're not supposed to do that. That's a violation of their law. Evidence for acquittal was to be presented first at trial, and that by the Sanhedrin itself. The council itself was supposed to begin with the thought in mind that this person is not guilty. When the trial starts, it's a presumption of innocence, right? Somewhat similar to our law. That's how it was supposed to begin. And the Sanhedrin itself was supposed to say, okay, here are the reasons why this person should not be found guilty. And that evidence is presented. Then the witnesses for prosecution would then present their case. So the Sanhedrin was supposed to start out in a position of, this person is presumed innocent. You're going to have to convince us that they're guilty. It's not what's happening here. They have already decided he's guilty. They're just trying to amass some people to try to give it some semblance of credibility. All right. Interestingly, this was also the case. Unanimous verdicts for death were thrown out. If the entire council ended up saying this person deserves to die, they would not take that action. Someone on the council was supposed to defend the accused. And so they wanted to keep from there being some kind of conspiracy or corruption. And so they would not accept unanimous decisions for death. And then a final thing, the charge on which Jesus would ultimately be convicted by the Sanhedrin is not the charge that they give to the Romans. They're going to charge Jesus with blasphemy ultimately. But when they take him before the Romans, they say, well, this man was trying to be a rival to Caesar. So it's a sham from start to finish. And those are just a few examples of some laws that they broke because they were intent on finding Jesus guilty and putting him to death. They had already decided that, and the law didn't make any difference to them. All right. 56. For many were giving false testimony against him. Their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. All right, so Mark emphasizes in 56 through 59 false testimony. He uses that language, that term twice, 56 and 57. Inconsistency, he mentions inconsistency in verse 56 and in verse 59. So false testimony, inconsistency. That's another part of the law, was they could not convict if the testimony was not consistent in a capital crime. So if you had conflicting testimony by witnesses, you couldn't sentence somebody to death. They sentenced him to death. Now the first charge, up until this point, all we're told is, yeah, they were inconsistent, false testimony and all that, but here's specifically the first charge that's laid out. Verse 58, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another made without hands. Well, they did not hear him say that because he never said that. No doubt it's an allusion back to John 2, verse 19. But Jesus never said, I will destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build another. Jesus in John 2 said, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll build another. But he wasn't talking about the edifice in Jerusalem. He was talking about the temple that was his body. So he was saying to them, you destroy this temple, this body, you kill me, and after 3 days I'll rise again. That's what he said. He never said he was going to destroy it and in 3 days rebuild it, as if he was talking about that edifice in the midst of the city. But that was the first charge. All right. He made threats against the temple. Okay, charge number one. But Mark says, but they weren't even consistent in that testimony. Well, the high priest then, verse 60, the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? What is this that these men are testifying against you? Well, there's that violation of the law. Jesus was not supposed to be questioned in that way. He was the defendant was not required to say anything that might incriminate him, and so he wasn't supposed to be questioned. They were not to try to get him. It was a violation of the law for the court to try to pull out incriminating evidence from the defendant himself. And yet that's what they're trying to do here. But the witnesses had failed. They tried to amass these witnesses, and Mark keeps telling they were inconsistent. It was false testimony. They couldn't get their story straight. So the witnesses were bungling the whole thing. The witnesses were not helping. And I use witnesses in quotes. All right, so the witnesses had failed. They want Jesus to incriminate himself, and so they just start peppering him with questions to see if he'll do that. But he kept silent, verse 61 says. But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. So the high priest keeps questioning him, but now notice the charge is different. At first, they're going after this temple thing. He made threats against the temple. Now they're coming at him for something else. All right, what about this Messiah thing? What about this Christ thing? Are you the Christ? All right, so they're trying to get him to incriminate himself. Are you the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And he said another thing, and if you'll let me paraphrase, if you'll allow me to do that, Jesus said, and at some point you're going to see the Son of Man, talking about himself, sitting at the right hand of power. In other words, there's going to come a time when you're going to be the one judged by me. He was in the position at that point of being judged by them, but there was going to come a time when those roles were going to be reversed. But he admits that he is the Christ. All right, well, that's all that the high priest needed. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. So the high priest got what he wanted. Jesus spoke up and he said, look, you've heard the blasphemy. And he turns to the rest of the guys on the council and says, how did you guys agree with me? Anybody, any dissension? They all condemned him deserving of death. On the same day as the trial, which was a violation of the law, and I'll add this, in the Mishnah, again, Sanhedrin section, chapter 7, section 5, on charges of blasphemy. Blasphemy, according to that section of the Mishnah, only occurs when one utters the name of God and curses it. So, according to their definition of what blasphemy was, one must utter the name of God and curse the name of God. Did Jesus do that here? He did not. And yet they charged him with blasphemy, another violation of their own law. And then we'll stop here at 65. Some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers received him with slaps in the face. Now Mark is about to, from this point, turn back and say, okay, now here's what's going on with Peter. So we're going to stop here. But notice that in 65, spitting, blindfolding, beating him with their fists, slaps in the face. What is that? It's abuse. Another violation of the law. The Sanhedrin was not to do anything. These are supposed to be impartial judges. But what this shows is their indescribable hatred of Jesus. You can't, we sometimes use the expression, they hated him with a purple passion. You can't get more deeper purple than this. The prejudice against him, the words aren't strong enough to describe this hatred, this vitriol. It's amazing how violent their tempers were and their attitudes were toward Jesus, and it shows here in this mockery of a trial, and the pitiful way that that they're treating him, the lack of dignity as a human being. It's just it's beyond the pale. All right, we're going to stop here, and we'll pick it up here next time. God willing, we'll finish out the chapter and move on with the rest of his trial as he goes before Pilate, then the Romans, and then his crucifixion. Let's pray. Father, thank you for time to study, and our hearts break when we read about the mistreatment that Jesus suffered at the hands of his own creation. Our hearts break because we also understand that it wasn't just the sins of the people in his own day, but the sins of the entire world, including our own. And while our hearts break for that treatment, on the other hand, we're so grateful that he was willing to subject himself to all of that because of the benefit that we have received because of his suffering, the salvation that we have from the guilt of our sins. Please accept our thanks. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, my friends, until next time, you guys have a good week. Love you.